which exists to improve the quality of lives for people living in rented homes. We work with about 120, 130 different housing associations and local authorities across the country, and that's end-to-end, north to south, east to west, all sorts of different ages of stock and property. We've got tens of thousands of devices and all sorts of different properties. So why is that information useful? How does that work? So firstly, our device sits in a central location, typically in a hallway. From a resident perspective, they get a smart thermostat, saving them money on their heating bills, they're thrilled. From a landlord perspective, you understand about the true performance of the property and the needs of the resident and how those two things fit together. So I just want to talk about the sort of fundamentals of damp and mould. So 4 points I want to run through. Firstly, under heating, thermal performance, the property fabric, and excess moisture generation. And I want to run through each of those and show you that the data suggests something really quite different from what we expect to see. So firstly, let's talk about under heating. Now, a clear line from the Ombudsman, and I will come back to it, and I totally agree with this before I get too many evils. Poverty is not a lifestyle choice, and I 100% agree with that, and we'll talk about that. But we cannot ignore the impact of the energy crisis over the last couple of years, because fundamentally, if you cannot afford to heat your home, all your other mould measures, to a point, are largely worthless, right? The level of ventilation you need to have in a cold home is knocking on infinite. You don't have the windows open all the time. And I just want to give you a feel for quite what the scale is. Now, we're in a privileged position. We can see what the performance of all these different the thermostats are, what people are choosing to do with their money, and they're choosing to do with their homes. So that's one. Okay, cool. So this is a winters. Okay, so it's a bit weird because sort of December's in the middle here. But these are the last 3 winters running across here, and we've got these are the properties, potential properties with a temperature of less than 18 degrees, where 18 degrees is the NHS's definition of fuel poverty. So people are choosing to, people properties are less than 18 degrees. Over the last period, so the change between the winter of 20 and 21 and the winter of 22 and 23, so the last 2 years, the number of properties, the proportion of properties that were under 18 degrees have increased by 90%. 90%. That's knocking on 1 million additional homes where they are consistently less than 18 degrees. And we start looking at the behaviour on that. I got a home, I got a thermostat. What did I do when it came to the winter? The same as everyone else did in social housing. We all done our own housing. We turned down the thermostat. So on average, we turned it down by knocking on just under 2 degrees, which is quite a material change. And the other thing that we did differently, and I did it, and we see it across everyone else doing it, is that we have our heating on for shorter periods of time. So when you've got a limited budget, we like radiant heat. You want to stand next to a radiator and you want to feel warm. Now the best thing for mould is that you heat your house at a low temperature for a long period of time. And that's not fun. You'll get anything out of that. What you want is that kind of warmth of having the heating on. And having the heating on for short periods of time at a lower temperature effectively is the worst thing you can do for mould, because you're not actually heating the house properly. And one of the challenges we had, I think, came up to the point where you've got to understand where are the invisible people. There's such a strong correlation between people that cannot afford to heat their homes and the impact of mould. Not only are you more likely to get mould, but the mould you get is going to be more difficult to shift. You can go in, you can make massive changes. If the house was cold before, and you invested a lot of money in making changes in mould washes, etc., it's cold afterwards, it is going to come back. And these two problems are very much interrelated. Change type. Cool. So the next one then, thermal performance. So the actual the performance of the thermal performance of the home is very important. It's the temperature on the walls that's going to drive the mould on this one. We've been doing quite a bit of research on lived experience. So looking about what it's like to be a tenant and how do we make decisions about how you heat your home. And so we've come up with this metric. It's called a heat loss rate. So effectively, from the moment that you turn your heating off, how long does it take the property to cool down? How long does it take to lose 1 degree? So in a good property, in a well-insulated property, it will be a number of hours for it to lose 1 degree. In a bad property, in some cases, there's a proportion of those that are well under an hour. They've dropped in temperature. So what we then say is, well, let's have a look at that against EPC. And what we find is there is little or no correlation between the time to lose property, the lived experience of tenants, and EPC data. And that extrapolates to the point of there's some pretty serious questions about the way that we're approaching properties and the way that we're using EPC as a guideline here, when the data would suggest that actually the lived experience of tenants doesn't relate to it. So that makes it very challenging, right? And I think the point I'm going to build to as a conclusion is we have to understand the individual performance of each property. We have to understand the individual requirement of each tenant in order to put the right resources in the right place. Because if we go by assumptions, we're not going to get there. Next one then, property fabric. The classic myth is it's about the age of the property. It's actually about the age of the property. So I just thought I'd chuck up here. This is the propensity for damp and mould versus age of properties. They're slightly grouped on EPCs. So they're slightly grouped from EPC data. There's little or no correlation between the age of the property and the propensity for condensation, damp and mould. So every generation of property has had its problems. So the new properties are particularly bad. There's different generations at different times. But to go and say there was a particular group or stuff, Victorian is just not true. The data that comes back is that the lifestyle is a much more dominating factor. The way that people are interacting with the property, their ability to heat their home is much more powerful than going in for any particular group of properties. The last thing I want to cover off is about excess moisture generation. And this is definitely playing to the Ombudsman's point here, that poverty isn't a lifestyle choice. There's a lot of the data that we come back will show particular behaviours. So we'll see when people have been cooking or when they've been having sort of long showers. You can see the moisture that's created in a short period of time, and you can see the impact of that. I think the big word of warning here is, and we've been out and engaged with thousands of properties across the UK, is that consistently the measures that were in the property in order for it to perform for its natural ventilation, those measures aren't performing as they were originally designed to perform. Whether that's the trickle vents have been painted over, not by the tenant, but maybe you've got an extractor fan and it's taped over, or maybe the fuse has gone. And I just want to give you a really very simple example of the sort of data that we're putting out of our system here. So what we've got here on the orange line running on the top here is humidity. Highlighting this is pretty sort of humidity into the mid 70% here. The only difference here was changing the fuse and the extractor fan. Right? That was it. All the measures were there. They just weren't working, and no one had engaged with it and assumed it was the fault of the tenant that they were creating too much moisture in the property. So a big challenge on there. Poverty is not a lifestyle choice. People should be able to use their home as a home and just check that the measures that were originally designed as the property are functioning as we would expect. Cool. So those are the 4 drivers of mold that I wanted to run through. Underheating, do not underestimate the impact of the fuel crisis last winter. It was huge. 1 million more social homes are choosing to heat their property less than 18 degrees. Thermal performance, there's not a strong, arguably no correlation between EPC and the lived experience of tenants. Property fabric, there is no correlation between the age of properties and the propensity for condensation, damp and mould. And finally, on excess moisture generation, people have the right to live in their homes. It's always worth checking that the measures that were designed into the property are functioning as we wanted them to before blaming the tenant for their behavioural choices. I'll make one last tiny plug, which is about communication. The switching device has got a screen, it's 4.5-inch touch screen. By engaging with residents, by talking to them about mould, by talking to them about their behaviour, we get a 90% response rate in 24 hours. And residents love that they're being listened to, they're being engaged in the journey, and they have this private communication with their landlord. I'll stop pitching. Lovely, thank you.